I'm privileged to be here with Professor D.C. Schindler, who is Professor of Anthropology and Metaphysics at the John Paul II Institute in Washington. For my money, one of the smartest, most articulate Catholic philosophers on the scene today. So delighted, David, to be with you today.
It's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
Well, good. Thank you. And you've written a number of books, of course, on a lot of topics, and I find them all fascinating. I want to focus on this one, The Politics of the Real, which is a fascinating discussion of, a lot of topics that are both in the news, but also at a high theoretical level, especially around liberalism. And much discussed. We got liberalism, we have post-liberalism, we have anti-liberalism, we have classical liberalism, right. We have wokeism, which is a kind of extreme form of liberalism. So I wonder, before we get really into it, if you could just give me in brief compass, a sense of what you mean when you use the word liberal or liberalism.
Brief compass is a little difficult. I can start simply. Liberalism basically, it's modern political thought. That arose in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. I think we're all familiar with the founding figures, Locke, Hobbes, and so forth. But at a deeper level, so this is classical liberalism. At a deeper level, it seems to me, when you put it in the context of history and especially in relation to the church, it seems to me you begin to see that this what was effectively a political theory actually is a whole vision of reality. So. In part, this was a political vision. I think that grew up as a kind of an alternative to Christendom, which is a culture founded in the church. This is an alternative to that, and because it's an alternative to that, it encompasses much more than just a new way of doing politics. It's a vision of the human being. It's a vision of nature. It's a vision of economics and so forth.
Let's talk about the metaphysical side of that.
Sure.
You begin with some musings on that little Latin phrase, res publica. I remember when I was doing Latin 101, we did our declensions with res publica. So it's a phrase I've known for a long time. But you put a stress on the res part of that, the thing part of it, the reality. And there's some kind of disassociation with reality, let's say at least as the classical Catholic metaphysical tradition put it out, within liberalism. Talk about that as you see it.
I think that sort of surprises people because, again, typically we think it's just a political theory. And the idea is that liberalism is, it's founded in a kind of a social contract. It's founded on the idea that society is made up of individuals who have free will and they choose to organize themselves in a particular way. So it doesn't seem to have much to do with metaphysics and so forth. But one of the trails that I've tried to follow out in my work is to see that those what seem to be fairly straightforward assumptions actually you're rethinking the individual's relationship to reality and beginning with just pure power to choose as what most basically defines us as individuals. That in all sorts of really subtle but profound ways cuts us off from reality. It sort of establishes a kind of filter that separates us. Now we do all sorts of things to try to overcome that, but I think a lot of that separation is sort of built in. So I thought, well, let's approach this question not again in simple political terms, but actually try to get at some of these deeper philosophical, metaphysical, and theological roots. And I thought, okay, the way you begin is with things, the reality of things that confront us in a way prior to our freedom of choice.
Right. And that harkens back to some of your earlier work. I think you say in this book at one point that the good is not chosen so much as given, right? That the good manifests itself and that we become beholden to it.
That's right.
Where so much of the liberal assumption is, no, what's in first place is my freedom, my will. And now I choose. Right. And if that's your choice, well then God bless you, that's great. That's right. As opposed to, no, the good in different ways manifests itself, it gives itself. That's right. And then we're obligated to bring our wills and our freedom in line with that. That's a whole different metaphysical vision, isn't it?
It is, absolutely, and that's a nice way to put the point. The good, for something to be genuinely good, it precedes us. It sort of strikes us with its intrinsic goodness. I think we all have the experience of something connecting to something simply as a matter of choice, that we have complete control over it. Those kinds of things tend not to hold us or compel us. Because we can change our mind the next day, and we have the sense of our will being fairly volatile and arbitrary. But true goodness is given, and where is it given? It's given in our fundamental relationships in our family. We're born into a family, and it's given in the things that surround us and in their reality. And if we try to reconceive ourselves as having our foundation and our roots in this given connection to the world, it really changes everything. It forces you to rethink quite a few realities
you
that
and
we
I
take
have,
for granted.
I think we have Monsignor Robert Sokolowski in common as a teacher.
That's
When
right.
I was a young kid at Catholic U, we read Hobbes's Leviathan, and Hobbes says there very explicitly, what the old moral doctors call the good is just the last thing you happen to choose. If I choose it, then I call that the good. Right. It's a purely sort of conventional sense of the good. That's a revolution. Sokolowski taught me that 40 years ago. Right. That's a whole revolution in metaphysics and psychology and spirituality. Right. But I would say almost every teenager in America has that as the default position. Right? All that matters is it was my choice to do it.
Yeah.
But who's there articulating these values?
Right.
Someone else we have in common is Dietrich von Hildebrand, who's someone I follow with great enthusiasm. And that whole idea of value and value response. Right. It's not my stupid will that's determining things, but this value makes itself manifest.
That's right.
Is that near the heart of what you're trying to get at?
It really is. The one of the ways to sort of set that into relief with students, I found when I used to teach undergraduates, is to ask them if they're saying something different when they say, I like something and it's good. Is that, are you saying exactly the same thing in those? Right. Of course, and everybody recognizes. Right. And that's the thing that's kind of interesting. Even though we are immersed in this particular way of viewing things, we're still natural human beings,
right.
and the reality sneaks in all sorts of ways, and we can tap into that. That's something that one can connect with. One of the ways is this experience of value, as Dietrich von Hildebrand puts it. I like to think of it as an expression of beauty, what beauty is, and how beauty strikes us in a way, takes us by surprise, and that seems like just a minor thing to be taken by surprise. But if you think about what does that mean? It means that the reality of this thing is hitting me before I can prepare myself and set terms for it and dictate how it's going to be.
It rearranges my subjectivity. My subjectivity is not the lord of this experience.
Yeah, that's right.
That's in your earlier work too, and it's a very Platonic idea that of the transcendentals, the beautiful comes first.
Yeah, right.
And then that whole surprise element and the wonder, the splendor of something. And then afterwards you say, oh, that corresponds to the truth of the mind and the good that the will seeks.
That's right.
But the first thing that strikes us is that's beautiful.
Right.
And it's in Dante, it's in James Joyce, up and down the great tradition.
Yeah.
But if I'm reading you right, that's a real danger inherent in liberalism that so privileges the individual and choice that gets bracketed.
Right, and I mean, I think it's not hard to see that we've trivialized the meaning of beauty. I mean, it's to use that language. Balthasar, Hunters von Balthasar, the great theologian, observed that. It's truth and goodness are the ones that seem serious to people, whereas beauty doesn't seem to have that sort of gravitas
or frivolous.
Right. Yeah. It tends to be trivialized, and you see that. I mean, even artists in the contemporary modern world, they tend not to be concerned with beauty because beauty strikes them as bourgeois,
Right.
and facile and comforting. They're right to react to that because they're reacting to a trivializing of beauty.
Yeah.
But the response to overthrow it entirely and try to be edgy, try to be anti-beauty, and the ugly, it's the flip side of the same coin. And we see this kind of thing, I think, in many different realms of our existence. This properly human reaction to a trivializing or an impoverishment, but then because we don't have our roots in the tradition, the reaction just tends to be more of the same.
It's not in the res. It's not in the thing, right? This objective value. Something that jumped out at me from your book here, because I've been thinking about this a lot. Why is safety such a prime value in our kind of wokest culture now? And talk about that a little bit, because I've said to people before, if you're a Christian, what we have before our eyes all the time is the crucified Jesus. And I said, now, whatever that religion's about, it's not putting a huge premium on safety, whatever that is,
That's right.
or the lives of the saints. You never say, well, no, they were really dedicated to safety, these people. What is it about this liberal problem that would kind of conduce toward the valorization of safety?
That's a big question too. It's so interesting how any one of these questions you can unfold and start to see the whole thing. But the question of safety is a good way in. It seems to me that safety is one of those things that seems like a safe, universal value. Everybody can be. This is a good common denominator. We're all, insofar as we're all living beings, we're all concerned to continue our life. So safety is something we all have in common. But that the difficulty there obviously is it reinforces all of these habits of egocentricity, you might say, in terms of our reconception of what the will is and what the intellect is and what a human being is. Safety plays into that. So it seems like it's something that nobody can get upset if we talk about safety, but in fact it's a subtle thing. Safety makes sense for a human being in a deeper context. Christians don't say, right, as you pointed out, our first concern is the safety and well-being of our parishioners. Although we heard some of that during the COVID times. That's not a Christian worldview, certainly.
No, it's the adventure of mission, maybe, or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and the love of God. I mean, love is not safe, and it's never been safe. And the word safety doesn't occur to you when you're in love. That's.
Yeah, and to your earlier point about like the truly beautiful is not safe; it's dangerous. The truly beautiful, because it breaks in. Right. What's good on that, I think, is Iris Murdoch, the Irish philosopher and novelist. That how the good has this quality of. It arrests us. It's Balthazar too. I mean, it stops you in place, and it rearranges you and then sends you on mission. Yeah. So if safety is your thing, you're going to create a buffer around yourself of protecting my choice all the time. That's right. And I won't let the truly beautiful in. Right.
That's right. Yeah. No. Think about that. So I mean, her line I absolutely love. I always tell my students that this is one of those they need to put on the refrigerator. But love is the difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Yeah. Is real.
That's Murdoch,
Yeah. So the res again.
Right.
The reality of something that because it's, insofar as I recognize it as real, that in itself is a recognition that I have a responsibility to adapt myself to it. I have to conform to it. In a certain sense, if safety is what is setting the horizon, reality has to be reinterpreted, beauty has to be reinterpreted. All these fundamental human values have to be reinterpreted in a way that will fit. And I think that they end up being reinterpreted in ways that aren't really genuinely human.
Right. Our friend Monsignor Sokolowski again used an image years ago that's always stayed in my mind, that the once integrated Catholic vision of life at the Reformation and the Enlightenment blew up. It blew up, exploded, and the pieces of it landed in sort of distorted form here and there. And the good side of that is you can actually see bits of it if you're looking.
That's right.
The bad part is it's all kind of falling apart.
Yeah.
So maybe walk us through that a little bit as you see it. What was that integrated vision that in a way we've lost with the rise of the liberal mentality? What did it look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have increasingly been sort of compelled by this idea that the heart of Christianity, understood not only as a faith. I mean, obviously, it is very much a faith,
right?
But a faith that generates a culture that is a faith in the incarnate God, who is incarnate in the flesh of Christ, but then in the church and through the church into the world. So, if we understand that to be Christianity, it seems to me it's very illuminating to to recognize that it represents a kind of a creative synthesis of these classic cultures, the Greeks, the Jews, and the Romans, and that each of these cultures represents, they sort of present in a paradigmatic way some dimension of what human culture is meant to be. Its rootedness in nature, its creative, cultural, institutional aspect with the Romans, and then the theological dimension with the Jews. That Christianity, in a way, brings all of those together in a manner that allows them to illuminate each other, so that we only understand nature in relation to culture and in relation to God. We understand God in relation to, and so that it seems to me is what the Christian integration is. When that fragments, as you put it, we can sometimes have the illusion that picking up these pieces and putting them all on the table at the same time is more or less the same thing, because they're all there. But they've radically changed outside of that integration. So what that integration would have looked like concretely, and what it could look like again in the future, those are big questions.
So if the incarnation is a fact, and we hold that to be the case, God really becomes human in Jesus, but also then by extension, the church fathers saw this so clearly. In a way, God enters into all of nature and all of history and so on. And then the church, as the fathers also saw, the extension of the incarnation across space and time. As I understand your argument, that has huge political implications. If we take that seriously, we can't say, oh, that's a little private belief that I happen to have, in my subjectivity, and you've got your own beliefs. But if that's the case, that's really the res that we're talking about, then what does politics begin to look like?
Well, right. I mean, we have some intimation of that with the medieval vision, and obviously one can be romantic about that. But if we're just thinking about the principles, we have some intimation that the king is an anointed king, and he's anointed by the Pope, by the church. So what does that mean? By being anointed, he's sent on a mission. There's a sense in which, and this is why that's not theocratic. It's not so. Theocracy is when the religious figures, in a way, order society and make the call, as it were, take charge. Anointing is something different. This authority is handed on to the political order, but it's handed on by the church, and so the authority then that the king receives is a sacred authority that is responsible to the theological vision, and meaning responsible to God and His self-revelation, but responsible to the world as God created it. But it really is His responsibility. There's a certain freedom. There's a kind of autonomy of the political order that arises there, but it's a given autonomy, and that's something that's very different from establishing autonomy through separation. So I think we have a vision there. Now the question is, what do we do now? We don't live in a society where we have. You're not
interested in my becoming the mayor of Rochester.
That's right.
Right. So I'm the bishop of this diocese, but
that's right.
But talk about the distinction between potestas and auctoritas. So the state has a potestas, a real power, an independence.
That's right.
But an auctoritas, talk about that coming from the church.
That's right. Auctoritas. I mean, in fact, I've been working on a book on precisely that theme. But I'll try to keep it contained here. Authority has built into it a kind of I call a martyrological dimension. That to have authority means to look above. To see that there's an order that's given by God and has a kind of cosmological dimension, to look above and then to try to communicate that order below in a genuinely creative and prudential manner below. That authority sort of has that structure. Power is the execution of that task, carrying it out and taking up the various determinations that are required by that task. And it seems to me it's very different if we think of power as rooted in authority. And so that, again, here we have the anointing of the king. The king's power is received, and it will always bear the traces of the authority that communicated it.
Which in turn is grounded in a metaphysical vision, right? So the auctoritas is grounded there, and then it's communicated to the one who has potestas. And you're not asking the religious authorities to be micromanaging civil affairs.
Right. I mean, obviously that would be something potentially quite frightening.
Right. Yeah. But we're getting ahead of the game a bit there because I wanted to get to that toward the end of our conversation. But in some ways it's the hinge, isn't it? As you lay out this vision, because I think that's largely lost. In our understanding of politics, it often comes down to things like safety, protection, and do a Hobbesian number, protection from each other.
That's right.
That we're threatening each other.
That's right.
I'm threatening you, you're threatening me, so we need the Leviathan state to intervene to make sure we don't kill each other. And then bring it up. It's softened through Locke and Jefferson and others, but still, I've got these rights to my life, liberty, property, and so on. Government's instituted to protect those rights. It's protective, not directive. We can put it that way. And now, why? We say, well, there's been a loss of an overarching metaphysical vision. That happened. It fell apart. And you've got a lot of warring religious voices and disagreement, deep disagreement about metaphysical, absolutes. And so could you argue that's where, liberal modernity comes from? It comes out of this conflict about a comprehensive sense of the good. So is it the best we can manage, or can we ever get that toothpaste back in the tube?
Well, that's a very big question. And before addressing that, I do just want to point out some of the things that you mentioned, just drawn, because that was a very rich statement. When you radically when you prioritize, let's start there. When you prioritize freedom of choice. That implies a kind of self-enclosed monad of sorts, a kind of an atomistic sense of the individual that defines himself in separation. Now, if society is made up of those kinds of atoms, it's conflictual.
We'll be at odds with each other.
By necessity, but the very logic of it. And even when you cooperate, your cooperation isn't genuine intimacy or connection. It's the other side of manipulation. So there are all sorts of subtle ways that the violence remains as part of the cooperation. That sort of radical individualism, as you pointed out, it's very evident in Hobbes, requires a strong centralized government. So ironically, radical individualism coincides with a kind of an absolutist sense of governance. And there you have this arrangement that the government in one respect says we're not going to be determining, we're not going to be guiding you, we're simply going to be establishing rights. But because there's such a disorder, the very clearing of space for rights becomes a kind of an intrusive organization and direction. And so we begin to think of things like safety as the highest good that organizes our society. That becomes directive and not just protective.
Right. Yes, and to your point too, in other books of yours, everyone's got some overarching sense of the good.
Right.
Even if you're denying it, you say, "Oh, I'm not for all this metaphysical stuff."
Yeah.
Everyone has something that positions everything else.
That's right.
There's some summum bonum in the system, right?
Inevitably.
And you could say with the liberal system, it is just that. It's the protection of the individual, or it's keeping individual choice,
Right.
safe or whatever. But there is an overarching sense of the good. So the argument that no, all liberalism is doing is clearing a kind of neutral space
Right.
in which many points of view can flourish is not really credible, is it?
Well, on the surface, it's plausible, and there's something compelling. And it wouldn't have been so successful if there wasn't something compelling about it, because it seems to leave you free to believe all the things that you used to believe. All of these, you can be traditional in a liberal context. The problem is that in a subtle way, it's changing the landscape, and I mean, in a radical way. I sometimes say that it's allude to this old joke, Stephen Wright. I don't know if you remember him.
Sure.
The one-liners. He said once he came back to his apartment and discovered that all of the furniture had been stolen and replaced by identical replicas. And then his roommate came in and he said, "Have you noticed all of the furniture has been replaced?" And his roommate said, "Do I know you?" The point being that it's the same furniture that's been replaced, and it looks the same, but in a way, its origins, its meaning has changed, and I think that's the kind of thing that we have. We welcome people who have traditional beliefs in a certain sense, but they have to reinterpret them as traditional beliefs that play along with that have sort of accepted this new horizon and this new metaphysics ultimately. So that's important to keep in mind when this question comes up. What do we do now? Isn't this the best that we can do? We don't want to intrude. We have to recognize that there is a deep and serious prudential issue, but we have to recognize that we are intruding. I mean, in fact, there is a vision of reality that is being imposed on everyone. It's not as if the choice is between a neutrality and a substantial vision of the human being. In any event,
they're
we're
competing substantial visions.
Exactly. And then it's a fair discussion. Then you can actually have an open discussion.
Right, and it's on the same plane, the metaphysical
That's right.
plane. Let's talk about the American founding a bit.
Okay.
You live and work in Washington. I studied in Washington.
Right.
I grew up, revering the great American figures, the monuments to Jefferson, Lincoln, and Washington, and studied the founders. A standard telling of the story is, coming up out of an oppressive sort of medieval traditional arrangement, seeking freedom and equality and individual rights. The founders threw off these old forms and said, we're going to adopt this, new vision. The back of the dollar bill has the pyramid with the eye on top and Novus Ordo Seclorum underneath it. It's a new order of the ages. Right. And, look, as an American, I took that as a kid. This is great. That it was a new order of the ages, and thank God,
Right.
And then press it further, those who really advocate for the American founding, that all these values like freedom, equality, human rights are grounded finally in the Bible. They're coming up out of the Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. Now, in a mitigated form, a kind of a deist form and all that. But if someone were to argue with you and say, well, look, you're kind of a glass half empty guy. I'm a glass half full sort of guy. I see the founders as embodying a lot of the great values of the Christian tradition. What do you think is, at stake in how we read the founding?
There's a lot at stake, and this is the argument that one hears all the time, and it's an evident one because there are so many obvious achievements in the American regime, and for a time it was a model for the Western world and that kind of thing. There's less enthusiasm these days than there was 20, 30 years ago, and it seems to me one of the early critics of liberalism from a Catholic perspective was my father. I think he did some pioneering work, and he sort of predicted some things that I think are becoming evident now. So the question is, some of these extreme tendencies that we witness today, what's their relationship to the founding?
Yeah.
Is this a working out of presuppositions there? Is it the case that once you've tried to start a political order from scratch, does that kind of revolutionary spirit, in fact, enter into and erode these values that we all, we can see these things, the dignity of the person, kind of a respect for the individual. These things have biblical roots, but if this new context, the new form that they have, as you said, people will generally concede that we're securing these goods on different grounds. Do those grounds actually sustain the very things that we hold dear? And
your
are they
father
capable?
argued no.
And he argued no.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we're starting to see that.
Yeah.
It's very hard these days to defend, say, traditional values of marriage, for instance, on the basis of principles that one sees at the founding. Typically, if one wants to defend things like traditional marriage, you have to appeal to a kind of a culture presupposed by the founding rather than the founding principles themselves. And that's telling to me. And then if we're going to do that, then let's go to their basic roots.
Yeah.
And find the most secure foundation for things like freedom of the individual and dignity and so on.
Which leads to the question then naturally, what do you do when there is no consensus around these questions of basic goods?
Right.
So let's say with Sokolowski, yes, it fell apart. It blew up. Well, we got to deal with that. And is John Courtney Murray right in saying what we have in America are articles of peace? It's not an overarching account of the good.
Right.
Murray might say, look, I'm a Jesuit priest. I know all about that. But our founding documents are more articles of peace. How do warring people get along with each other? So there's a Hobbesian element there, but you might say, look, that's inevitable.
Right.
We have to have that. What do you do when there is no consensus about the grand metaphysical questions?
Right. Well, you suffer, first of all. But the suffering has to be in the context of holding fast to what's true. And it seems to me, prudentially speaking, this may be the best that we can do. So prudentially speaking, but I would want to insist on the robust and what I would call the authentic meaning of prudence, which requires in the first place a robust recognition of the truth in its authentic sense, its full sense, and in light of that, what's the best we can do in these particular circumstances, and that's a different kind of thing, because if you think in those terms, the particularity of the circumstances are actually being elevated into the truth in some way. A certain light gets cast on them that would be slightly different. Typically, people will have a more impoverished sense of what prudence would mean, and they would say, "This is the best we can do. Let's take this as our absolute starting point." So it actually starts to become normative as opposed to one of the factors in the judgment.
Let's say, I want to cite Sokolowski again. I remember his saying years ago, what a blessing it was at our founding, some of the most brilliant people in political philosophy and political practice weirdly came together in one place at one time, from Adams to Jefferson to Hamilton to, so I'm going to put you in that room, whether it's 1776 or 1787, and you're hammering out the American thing. And you've got these brilliant people, Jefferson, that are certainly not going to share a grand sort of Catholic vision of the real or an incarnational ecclesiology. What would you have done? What would you have argued for in that room?
That's interesting. I've never imagined that. This would be a nice Ignatian meditation.
I could see you in colonial garb. And
maybe I'd kind of like to try out one of those wigs. But
and what would you argue for with Thomas Jefferson and John Adams?
I suspect I would want to ask the kinds of things that are presented as self-evident. What do we actually mean by those?
Yeah.
And what are we drawing on? What is the foundation on which we can say these things? And I would want to press beyond nature's God.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it seems to me that wasn't invented out of nowhere, and it wasn't just something to reason to from a kind of neutral premises. That notion itself has a tradition.
Yeah.
And it's not a Catholic one. It's not a Christian one.
Very consciously so.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Among many of those, I mean, Jefferson, in a way, he's an easy target with this because he had very, very self-consciously, deliberately a program of separating from the Catholic
monkish
tradition.
superstition.
The
and all
monkish,
that.
So there really was a kind of a program there of providing an alternative to what had previously been granted to us by God through Christ and the Church. Now is something we're going to try to recreate on our terms.
Would you go as far as George Will, who says that it's just boilerplate, that when Jefferson and company talk about God and nature's God, it's just boilerplate. They don't really mean it. They don't need these theological, but they were doing it as a kind of sop to the religious people at the time. I've never been tempted to go quite that far.
No, and I don't think you need to. I don't think you need to say that they were insincere. I actually think that they. Some people think that my criticism is that people were just pretending to be Christian and that secretly they were devising this. There are, as I said, there are some figures that were doing that, but it seems to me that the problem isn't that. It's not this secret program to undermine things. It's actually the ones that were most Christian friendly and serious about Christianity. I would want to ask them and pursue this question. What is it? How do you understand the relationship between faith and reason? What's the meaning of the church? What's the meaning of the tradition that has grown up in and through the church? That to me is the more decisive question because I mean it's a very simple point, but at the heart of this argument for me is do we recognize the goods that we rightly see in liberalism? Do we recognize those in their truth as having their roots in this organic tradition that we've inherited, or do we isolate them from that? And the most enthusiastic and sincere Christian believer can actually interpret these things as isolated from this tradition. So that's the main issue. And my contention is the moment you've separated from this tradition, it's going to evolve and devolve over time, and it really is a matter of time, and we're bearing the fruit of it.
And that we're seeing some of that now.
Yeah.
One thing I find really intriguing in your book is that the opposition of liberalism, not just to Christianity, but specifically to Catholic Christianity, with its strong incarnational emphasis and with the church as a kind of bearer of that incarnational presence. And we already referenced that Jefferson, I think it's a letter where he talks about getting rid of this monkish superstition. The other one, it's always intrigued me, is John Adams it's a diary entry, I think. He wandered into a Catholic church in Philadelphia during that, 1776 period. And was taken by it. I mean, he's caught up in the liturgy, and then he says, like, "Oh, how we ever managed to shake ourselves free of this?" So, is that really? It's a hinge to your argument that it's an opposition to the Catholic expression of Christianity,
right? Precisely because that's Christianity in its robustly traditional form.
Yeah, right.
I mean, one might say Orthodox too, but the main point is not choosing one, as we would say in modern lingo, one denomination over the other.
Right.
No, the point is recognizing Christianity as a tradition that has grown a culture and forms of life which include political forms, or not seeing as that, seeing it instead as just a faith which separated from that can't help but become essentially kind of a private thing. I mean that's the main concern.
Where did Tocqueville get it wrong? So I mean, the standard reading of Tocqueville is comes over here, witnesses American life, and says all this religious energy and diversity. Democracy without a religious foundation is going to founder. Yeah. But how wonderful that this kind of private space opened up by American freedom, allowing all sorts of religious expressions, and that informs public life, at least indirectly. I've mused about what do we do now, especially when that Tocquevillian equilibrium has really been compromised, as people are disaffiliating like mad from the churches. Belief in God is attenuating. Talk about Tocqueville a little bit. What did he get right? What did he get wrong?
Yeah, I mean, on that point in particular, it's interesting. He does make the observation that he thought in the long run it may be the case that only that religious will be Catholics. Yeah. And why did he think that? He was aware for all the things he admired, and he was such a perceptive reader of observer of humanity. He was concerned next to the positive gains that there were these sort of bond eroding principles at work, and that was going to lead to a certain thinning out of our social coherence and a certain kind of drift into a special kind of individualism, which he distinguished from selfishness. And I think that's really important. For him, the issue was more how we conceived of ourselves rather than, in the first place, whether we were kind to people or greedy and so forth. He thought that Catholicism might end up being the religion that remains precisely because it resists. You're baptized as a child. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. What does that mean? That institution is a recognition that the deepest part of our identities are not things that we choose for ourselves, but that are given to us, and eventually we do have to choose them, but we choose them inside of a relationship that's been already given to us. And my question actually is whether in the future, as things continue to unfold, if it's going to be again. Perhaps Tocqueville was more right about this than we realize. Perhaps it's going to be precisely Catholicism in its more traditional form, and I don't mean traditionalist.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Right, in its more traditional form, that's going to be attractive to people, and that there's a sort of a hope that this is responding to something that's been missing, and that we're missing in culture at large, but we're also missing in our personal lives.
What text has always intrigued me along those lines is Henry Adams, so the inheritor of this great American, colonial tradition and relative of two presidents and all that. But he writes Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres. He goes over to Europe and he takes in the culture we've been talking about.
That's right.
As a very perceptive American, but formed by, call it a very liberal, viewpoint. But then he comes into touch with this Catholic culture that just energized him extraordinarily.
No, isn't that interesting? I find that absolutely fascinating, and there's some great insights in that book. But here's sort of the ironic implication here is that perhaps Americans are in a privileged place to recognize the beauty of these things in a way that Europeans who have grown up in, when you have a cathedral in your town, that's going to change the way you think about, in subtle ways, and it's very easy to begin to take it for granted. But coming from the outside, I think there's an opportunity to rediscover the beauty of these things. Yeah,
and I do think it's happening among young people too. Especially in our wokest time, I'm kind of with those who say there's a trajectory within classical liberalism toward where we are now, because you got to just keep finding new groups to liberate and new forms of oppression, and and then the ever increasing focus on the self and the sovereignty of choice and all of that. But that's such a desert landscape, isn't it?
Right.
I think of like the Iris Murdochs and the Balthazars and the Dietrich von Hildebrands that would just see that as such a desert, and to open people to this kind of glorious, beautiful culture.
That's the hope, but it's actually an indication of at the same time of a special challenge these days. I think the post-liberalism is one of the big movements of our time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a growing movement, but I think it's arising precisely after liberalism. It tends to lack an anchor in something substantial.
Yeah.
And so we're beginning to see some really frightening instances. People are so tired of wokeism and the kind of exaggerated forms of liberalism that they want the absolute contrary as you sort of take solace or consolation in something that's a sort of a violent overthrow of that. And the problem is I think that this is a movement that's growing, and it's something that one can sympathize with, but it just sets into greater relief, I think, the special mission that Catholics have right now to try to show that
that's right.
It's because Catholicism isn't post-liberalism in the sense of something that's emerged after liberalism.
Yeah.
It predates all of our liberal institutions,
That's right,
and it's continued.
Yeah.
And so there still is this green branch extended to us that we can reattach ourselves to and restore a healthy culture.
I think that's right. A line of your book that just jumped out at me was James Madison himself says the first of the freedoms is religious liberty. The other one's grounded in it. Because I thought that's exactly what John Paul II says, that the first of the liberties is religious liberty. But articulate, I'm anticipating, but what's the difference between the way Madison put that and the way Karol Wojtyła would put that?
That's a great question. Karol Wojtyła never understood liberty apart from truth. So that was a great theme for him. In fact, I recently heard that if there was one sentence from Scripture that he, if all the rest would disappear, but he could hold on to one sentence from Scripture, the sentence that he would hold on to, he said, was the truth will make you free.
Set you free. Okay. Yeah.
So for Wojtyła, and I think this is a properly Catholic understanding of religious liberty, we have freedom to practice religion precisely because of the truth of religion, and it's being rooted in, again, I keep using this word, but being rooted in the tradition that actually enables you to first of all practice your own religion. But I would argue, and this hasn't always been recognized properly, adequately in history, but that also is precisely the same resource that would allow you to recognize the dignity of other traditions and so forth. That's very different from saying let's clear the deck, let's clear the space, and all possible claims for religion are equal. So that's a traditionless approach. And what happens there is that what you then give liberty to is not religion. It's because religion was always part of a tradition. It always had a cultural dimension. It was always public. It always included politics, the political sphere in its particular way. This is a freedom for you might say worship, understood as just strange little things that you do inside this private space, and faith as a private belief. That's what's being granted. So I don't think that's religious liberty at all.
Right.
I think it masquerades as religious liberty, and it can masquerade for a long time in a way that persuades a lot of people. But it's a very different thing.
Yeah, because I think that is a hinge upon which your book turns in a way, is that Madison and Wojtyła and how you understand those two things. I wonder if someone listening to our conversation might say, well, okay, this fellow sounds like an integralist to me. Like he just wants to, create one great theocratic sort of society. But the book, in fact, explicitly bears the title, The Church Between Liberalism and Integralism. So say a little bit about what differentiates your view from, it's a rising movement today of Catholic integralism. Yeah. What makes your view different from theirs?
Thank you for the question. I get called an integralist and confused for which is strange because anytime I've written about it, it's always been from a critical perspective. But it sounds like it because the one thing that I would affirm with them, and I'm grateful to that movement for, is a recovery of a sense that the church has a kind of an authority that bears on the political sphere in some respect. So that's something I think that we've conceded, and even the most sincere Catholics in the previous century conceded that too quickly. That the authority is a private matter, it doesn't have this kind of public form. So that's one thing I affirm with them. Where I differ, and I think this is a really crucial point, and in a certain sense I'll be hearkening back to things we discussed earlier, is that typically, and of course there's a spectrum of figures that claim integralism, but typically the idea is that the question for integralists is, to what extent can the church use the state? Well, there are two sides of it. One is, to what extent can the church use the machinery of the state to achieve her ends? So we take the political order as it is, the modern liberal state, but we try to redirect it to Catholic ends. So that's one side. And then the other side is this idea that a concession, again, of the political as only achieving partial human goods, ordered to things like safety, and then that gets supplemented by the church then stands for the sort of supernatural, the higher dimension of human existence, the spiritual goods, and so you add these together. This is a bit of a simplification, but you've got the human goods and then the spiritual goods. You put them together. I mean, a couple of points there. There'd be a lot to say, but just a couple immediate points. One is that spiritual goods are human goods. I mean, we're essentially spiritual creatures, and so even our life in this world is saturated by a concern for God. And this is something Christopher Dawson beautifully recognized, that religion has a necessary, that cultures are embodied religion. So that's that's not something that gets added from the outside. That's part of our political life. And then that means that the church doesn't have to control that from the outside. In a way, it's the anointing, the handing on of this particular task that also has a theological dimension. So the political order itself already has a kind of a theological mission, namely the theological dimension of our life on earth. There, in a way, the church reaches more deeply into society, but it does it in a way that allows the integrity of the political sphere. It doesn't have to dictate. So, to take a very concrete example, the church has no business making laws in a country, but it seems to me that the church represents an authoritative interpretation of what a human being is, what man and woman are, what
and therefore what the purpose of the law is ultimately.
And then the political order has to then realize this in whatever way it sees fit, but it receives this tradition as authoritative, and it operates freely inside of that. And I think that freely is a thing that distinguishes my position maybe from the
No, I get that. Let me just press a little bit, because I'm thinking of a conversation I had as one of the bishops of Minnesota. We went up to the state capitol about a year ago to meet with legislators. We met with the governor.
Interesting.
Yeah. And, we had our set of issues, and I was assigned to talk to the governor about the whole gender thing, because Minnesota has become like a sanctuary state, for those who want, which is appalling. Yeah. And so I told the governor that, I think this is appalling, and it's a shame that we're involved in this, and we'd like that to change. And he looked at me like I had two heads, and that was the end of the conversation.
That's right.
I'm trying to imagine, like within David Schindler's view of things,
what does one do?
What would that look like in a more ideal setting? What would I, as a bishop or representative of the church, do, or how would I do it to influence the potestas of the state?
Well, it's hard to give sort of general principles for that kind of thing, because these sorts of encounters are very particular. But it seems to me, whereas integralists want to immediately talk about, it's interesting. One of the first issues that they got worked up about is the question of whether the church could enlist the state to execute heretics, something like that. So I mean, this extreme case, and it's I mean, it's startling. But there you see the question is just who has power and how can you wield the power. It seems to me that the I like to think of it as the philosopher King in Plato's Republic, right? People think, well, that sounds tyrannical, the philosopher King. But how did the philosopher King operate in Plato's Republic? He went down into the cave, so he didn't command and impose an order. He came down, he entered into the condition of the people in there, and he asked questions. So that's how the philosopher King brought the light in. He asked questions. So it seems to me that questions that concern the matter itself. If one has a conversation with a politician, the point wouldn't be in the first place, what are you going to do about this moral issue? It would be, what's your purpose? How do you understand your task? Like what is it that you're trying to protect? And why do you protect these things?
In that very conversation, I said to the governor, part of the purpose of the law is to make us good, is to tell us what the good is. And if the law says this is permissible, it's a way of signaling to the soul, that's a good thing. Yeah. And if the law says that's not permissible, it signals to the soul, this is something that I should be avoiding.
That's right.
He looked at me with incomprehension.
Right. I mean, that's the thing is we these require long conversations. Right. Yeah. Right. But that's the way to go. And then you point out that that's not leaving people freedom. In fact, by establishing laws in this way, you're imposing a sense of the good. And if you can actually make that clear, then you can have an open conversation. Well, why on what basis? Why is this good, and how does it compare? And how do you respect this other view, which you claim to be able to respect? In fact, how do you do that?
And is it? I'm thinking out loud here, but would you hold the church has become too much sort of in a hand-wringing attitude and withdrawing too much from the public sphere, and that's not our business? And part of the answer is a boldness on the part of the church to come forth into the public arena, right? And to propose, as John Paul said, not impose, but propose our vision of life.
Unquestionably. And the thing is, the hand-wringing tends to be of a certain generation, speaking to people of a certain generation. I mean, young people want a bold proposal. And so there's no danger in doing that. I mean, I think we have so much evidence of that. The danger is that if the church doesn't make a bold proposal, there are a lot of people on the internet that are making bold proposals in a way that are deeply problematic. Right.
Something I've said it earlier in our conversation, as basic. There is no neutral space. There just isn't. Everyone's got a metaphysics. And then it's power language too. I mean, someone got in power to, let's say it, impose a basic metaphysical view. And we do have that in our public space, in our country. It's a certain metaphysical view, this privileging of the individual and choice and all of that. So let's have a vibrant public conversation about it, and the church proposes its view, and go back to Balthasar and von Hildebrand and company, do it in a beautiful way that's compelling.
That's right, and show that the resources are all there. That this is, so the danger would be that the church makes her proposal, other people make their proposal. We're meeting in this space, and everybody's kind of got a perspective. I think the church's proposal has to be bolder than that. And again, to go back to Socrates, when he made his argument with in the Gorgias, for instance, he said, it's not that I'm trying to convince you of my perspective. I'm trying to show that you yourself, So this was the sophist who was rejecting beauty, truth, and goodness. I want to show that you yourself are in disagreement with yourself.
Yeah, right.
And that's it seems to me that if the church's claim is true, it has to be the case that what the church. So here's the remarkable thing. It has to be the case that what the church is proposing is in fact at the very depths what everybody actually believes and wants.
And I hold that. I mean, I would hold that clearly as a Catholic. So maybe just be animated by that confidence to go into those conversations. Wasn't it Stanley Hauerwas, I think, said, I don't want the student to learn how to think for himself. I want him to think like me.
And that sounds, I mean,
arrogant, but it's based on a sense of, look, I think I have the truth here, which deep down you want too.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I always clarify that it's not that I have the truth; it's that the truth has me,
Yeah,
and you and I are in the same relationship to the truth. This isn't compete. See, liberalism has taught us to think that every interpretation of reality is a competing opinion over against others.
Yeah.
And it seems to me once you concede that, you're never
the game's over.
The game's really already over. And the point is that we don't begin with an opinion or an interpretation. We begin with a recognition that there's a truth that precedes us, so that when we attempt to articulate it, we actually have grounds for correcting our interpretation and recognizing what I had thought previously is actually not adequate. You can't really do that if it's competing opinions.
Listen, I could talk to you all day. Our time is up, though. Maybe it's a good note to end on, the beauty and universality of truth. But thank you so much for a great conversation.
Oh, thank you. It was really delightful.
God bless you.